Now, for Brigham Young, he'd only been a leader over 10 to 12 men in Zion's camp. And suddenly, he's got anywhere from 8 to 15,000 people that are facing guns, swords, problems, and he's got to get them out of the state. Now, it will be Brigham Young that will choose the state of Illinois as a place for safety. We could perhaps do all kinds of academic reasons. You'd say state of Illinois, the Missourians, they actually themselves and those from Illinois, they were not friends. And in fact, the people in Illinois were known to call the Missourians the Missourian pukes. Okay, what does that mean? Like if you get sick and you're going to throw up, that's what you guys are. And so Brigham concluded with that kind of nickname for them that perhaps the saints would receive a welcome. Now, for the Latter-day Saints, they will have a trail of tears, just as much as Native Americans had a trail of tears in the nation pushing them west to Oklahoma, to Arizona. Our trail of tears will be a 200-mile trail. And if you go to Missouri and you're in good shape, you may want to bike it, run it, don't die before you have the chance to do it. But our Trail of Tears is well marked, and it goes from far west, that temple site, all the way across the state to a place called Quincy, Illinois, which means you've also got to get across the Mississippi River. Now the question is, how does Brigham get everyone on that trail and heading to safety? And you realize he needs a leadership plan. For all of you, you're going to be leaders in your own right. You already are. And so you may want to try this plan. He tries to think, how am I going to get the orphans, the widows, the man that still has a wagon, how am I going to get the man with the wagon to take somebody else? And his conclusion goes like this. He announces to the saints, head to Illinois, meaning go back farther within the United States, head to Illinois, pass the Mississippi River, end up in a place called Quincy, Illinois, and he says, here's how we're going to do it. He said, what I'd like to do, he said, I'd like to invite you, and he would go up to individual men, always the man, and he would say to the man, what are you going to do to get the poor and bleeding out of Missouri to safety? And the man would say, oh, Brigham, I used to have some kind of money, but I've been burned out. So if I can get my wife and my children out, that's as good as I can do. And Brigham would say, well, there are people worse off than you are. And the man would say, oh, I can't imagine. So yeah, there are. And the man would say, I just can't do it. If I can get myself and my immediate family out, that's as good as I'm going to go for 200 miles. And then Brigham, his leadership style went like this. He would then say to the man, well, I just wanted to know if you would be able to help the poor and bleeding of Zion, because I wanted to be able to write your name in my book to remember you before the Lord forever. Now, I don't know, if I wrote anybody's name in my book, whether you think you had a better chance, but it's suddenly people are going, I got to get in Brigham's book. And they'd say, take my hat. And the other guy would go, I have a hat. Well, I don't care. Take mine. Did you hear? He will remember me before the Lord forever. Now, if you were to say, well, what about Brigham Young? Was he a hypocrite? You do this to help the poor, but, not me. And to show his willingness to help, although it's winter, and winter in Missouri, freezing. That wind, you get ice storms, and he literally gives away his only coat, and he walks out of the state wearing a quilt on his back. Okay, now, as he now walks out, we get him out of the state, and once you get him out of the state, you begin to have a most unusual kind of meetings that begin in Quincy, Illinois. And so now I'm going to talk, we leave Joseph in Liberty Jail. Okay, got that? And, well, let me do Joseph in Liberty Jail, but at least Brigham, he's moving the saints out. And once the saints start to move out, Joseph, is very lonely. And you'd say, Joseph, come on, you got 6 men in the jail, but, you know, I think they've said everything they liked about each other, thought of a thought, and they've said it, you know, more than once. And so for Joseph, the question is, what shall he do with his time? In other words, 5 months, you know, still in the jail, and the saints are moving, and nobody's stopping in as a visitor. Sorry. Anyway, his conclusion was, you know, when I really do have that trial here in the town of Liberty, his conclusion is, I'd like to defend myself. And Sidney Rigdon feels the same. And so Alexander Donovan, who lives next door to the jail, one day when he came to visit, they asked, can we borrow your law book? Now, back then, and actually still today, the name of the law book is Black Law Book, and it's huge. And it has, you know, all of the different laws, courts, you know, everything if you're taking constitutional law. And with the idea, Joseph and Sidney would study to become lawyers. Now, for all of you that like lawyer jokes, you know, perhaps good, but just know at one point, Joseph had seen himself defending himself as a lawyer. Now, so you'd say, well, what are they doing in their random time? And the answer is, they're actually studying. Now, this was a time in the United States when you could one day put out a sign and say, I'm a doctor. And the next day you could put out a sign and say, you know, I'm a businessman, I'm an attorney, I'm an Indian chief, you know, I mean, it was that kind of time. And so both men now study. Finally, it's time for their trial to come forward. As their trial now nears, Sidney Rigdon concludes, I will defend myself. In other words, I will be my own attorney and I will do my case separate from these other prisoners. For Joseph, he doesn't feel as confident in his legal ability. And so who's he going to choose? Alexander Donovan again to defend him. Now notice, Donovan lost in that military tribunal. Donovan lost at the Richmond hearing, but nevertheless, Joseph thinks he's good, and he's going to use him, and all the other prisoners say, yeah, we'll take Donovan. Well, okay, it's a court scene. This time the court is different. You have the judge, he has the gavel, and he can make the decision. In other words, wow, Joseph, this is final. This is not your hearing. And there is a jury, and at that time in the United States, there are only gentlemen of the jury. In other words, no women can serve on the jury. Okay, courtroom is now filled. Latter-day Saints are now present. And the first case that's going to go forward is the state of Missouri versus Sidney Rigdon. Now, for Sidney Rigdon, he did not walk into the courtroom, but he was brought into the courtroom lying on a cot. Okay, what does cot mean? Let me make sure everybody gets it. Well, it's like a bed, but he's brought in and you'd say he's not feeling well. Now, notice all the lawyer movies you'll see. I've never seen, you know, Perry Mason, he was, you know, moving around, you know, and, you know, they're very theatrical. But I've never seen anybody come in kind of lying on a bed. But here comes in Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, from laying down, now addresses the gentlemen of the jury to plead his case. As he addresses the gentlemen of the jury, he indicates before the jury, he said, I want you to know that I am a follower of Jesus Christ, and I want you to know how much I have suffered because I follow Christ. Whose speech is he repeating? Joseph's, and where was he? Joseph's in Independence. Remember when the woman yells out, are you really Jesus Christ? And, okay. So all of a sudden you'd say, Sidney, well, he talks about Samuel Lucas, he talks about tar and feathering, and he talks about, you know, I've been in Richmond jail, I've been here in Liberty, let me describe horrible conditions. And when he reaches the apex of his talk, he says, now I have suffered worse than Jesus Christ. Okay, what do you think of that? Well, gentlemen of the jury, remember, Sidney Rigdon, you learn in the Doctrine and Covenants, he's a spokesman, he's an incredible speaker. I think we would have all just, you know, sat spellbound. But the gentlemen of the jury, they're very moved. The judge is so moved. And he now turns to the gentlemen of the jury. He indicates to them, I hope it won't take you long to make a decision on this good man. Okay, well, is he priming them? You bet. And the gentlemen of the jury, they conclude, we don't have to even leave the courtroom. In other words, they kind of turn one to another. The head man of the jury stands up. There are 25 charges against Sidney Rigdon, and the jury conclude he is not guilty of all charges. Okay, what's Sidney Rigdon now?
Free.
He's free. And so he's a free man. And you'd say the judge is so moved. The judge takes his hat out of a drawer. He then passes it among the gentlemen of the jury and all those that are there and indicates that he doesn't want this man to have hard feelings about everything in liberty. So could you put in some money so that when this man is free, he can now leave our town and buy a new suit of clothes and get himself a horse, and off he can go to Quincy. Okay, you get it? But he can go to Quincy, and none of the Latter-day Saints there are the wiser. In other words, 200 plus miles difference, and Sidney now, gallops off, by himself. Okay. Meantime, it's now time for the state of Missouri versus Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and the others. And Donovan now, before he starts, he turns to Joseph and he says, I have never heard a better attorney. And he said, who did that man study under? Because you always try to study under like a Supreme Court justice or something like this. And Joseph says, nobody. Do you remember you gave us the book? We just read part of the book. And suddenly Donovan, he said he never heard anybody better. And then Donovan turns to Joseph and says, have you suffered as much as that man? And Joseph says, yes, but much worse. And Donovan now wants to know, well, can I use the line? The line that kind of moved everybody and got the free verdict. And Joseph said, no. He said, I have not suffered worse than the beloved son. Well, okay. Here goes Donovan. He's got his sleeves up. He's ready to go. He's a theatrical attorney. But you know what? He does what? Does he win? No. Every time he defends Joseph, he loses. Every time he seems to defend those 185 before the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri who are criminals, he wins. It's just, okay. Okay, as a result, the conclusion is Joseph and fellow prisoners will go back to Liberty Jail because Donovan yells, we will appeal. Okay, what does it mean, appeal? Okay, we're going to keep this going forward, even if we have to take it. And notice he's used to taking criminal cases before the Supreme Court. So here we've been in the town of Liberty. We're going to appeal this up to the kind of next level. Well, in the meantime, Joseph and fellow prisoners, they are confined to Liberty Jail after the trial. It will be after this trial that Joseph appears very discouraged. And, because Sidney's free, he's back. It seems so unjust. And at this point, Joseph now says, O God, where art thou? Where is the pavilion that covereth thine hiding place? Where can I find this? Doctrine and Covenants, sections 121, 122, 123. Okay. Oh God, where art thou? Where is the pavilion that covereth thine hiding place? And then notice how the Lord responds. If you are in bonds, and you'd say, oh yeah, he's been in shackles. If your wife and children are taken from you, remember, the kind of bayonet on the end of a gun, the sword out there, if you have all things, he says, thou art not yet as which Old Testament prophet? Job. In other words, remember, Job had a definite journal entry date. You go, well, I lost, all my possessions, I lost my kids, and his wife says, your breath stinketh, and, he's got, he's just the worst of the worst. And so the Lord says to Joseph, thou art not yet as Job. In other words, Sidney thinks he suffered more than the beloved, But Joseph, you don't even have a journal entry day. In other words. And then the Lord says, I am God. Thou art Joseph. And then the Lord says, who's man that he thinks he can put forth his puny arm and stop the mighty Missouri? In other words, the mighty river. And then Joseph, be still. In other words, peace, and watch the hand of the Lord. Okay, so that's a response. All right. With that, we're going to do, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of the rest of the story so we can pull this all together. Because you got to have questions about, okay, what happens? I'm going to start with, we talked a lot about pretty interesting characters, don't you think, in this part? Okay, so are you curious to what happens to Governor Boggs? Okay, well, some. Okay, so Governor Boggs. Remember, he's the one that issues what kind of order? Extermination order. So when the Saints have left from Missouri, he's on a real popular roll. In other words, the whole state appeared to want Joseph out. And so Governor Boggs decides, I don't want to be governor again, but I want to represent Missouri, which in his mind is a higher step up in the Senate in Washington, D.C. Now, while he's running for senator, he is shot. And, so someone tried to kill him, and he's shot with buckshot. And, if they'd used a silver bullet, he might have died. But the buckshot, it's like little BB guns, they sprayed him. And he has some of this buckshot down in his chest, most of it in his throat, and some up as high as his cheekbones. Anyway, he will survive the shooting. And you can imagine, because of the shooting and the popularity of the getting the Mormons out of the state, he wins on a landslide vote. And suddenly Governor Boggs, now Senator Boggs, is in Washington, D.C. Well, in Washington, D.C., he was given the longest nickname I've ever heard of anyone. And the nickname was Man Whose Head is Full of Balls. And you're like, it doesn't sound like Johnny. It doesn't sound like Susie, Willie. It's Man Whose Head is Full of Balls. And what it was, he had the habit for the rest of his life playing with his skin. Because although a doctor came in and took out, a lot of these little lead pieces that were in his skin, he didn't get them off. And so Governor Boggs would push and pull on his skin until he'd bring it out and he'd go, look at this, I was shot, see this, and they would say, truly, sir, you are a man whose head is full of balls. Well, okay. So for Governor Boggs, now senator, after he's senator, the Mormons are rising up in Illinois, in the state right next to him. And he starts to become very paranoid. And his conclusion is, I got to get farther away from the Mormons. And so he decides he will head to California. But the crazy thing, as he's going, this great distance, you have these pioneer companies coming right after him. And the company that's directly behind Boggs is Brigham Young's company. And so if you were to say, who's the fastest, going all the way, and I'd say, well, it's Boggs, he's sure that Brigham's after him. Okay. He gets to California, and while in California, he is appointed by the Mexican government, the Spanish down there. He is appointed to be what's called an alcalde, meaning he is like a mayor of all Northern California. That would include Sacramento, San Francisco, Sonora Valley. Okay, so he now has this political setup, and you would say he becomes very well-to-do, and he dies rich. But, okay, there was a prophecy made by Parley P. Pratt, and the prophecy went like this, that Governor Boggs was so mean that when he died, no grass would grow on his grave. And so, and the other part of the prophecy is that when he died, there would not only be no grass on the grave, but that he would be buried within the shadow of a Latter-day Saint meeting house. So he's buried in a place called Napa, California. And you know, in California, it's kind of like here. You have two weathers, but especially in Northern California, your weather is morning and afternoon. Okay, it's not like it's freezing. It's it's just it's pretty much. But okay, so here's the graveyard. Here's the stake center, and on certain times of the day with the shadows, the spire of the stake center literally goes over Bob's grave. Well, people in that who are old timers in the stake center said for years nothing grew on his grave, and it's a very manicured graveyard. But suddenly there's this 6-foot plot with no grass. And so they'd have, different experiments. They would take their scouts, up there and we'll lay out turf. And now we'll put in grass seeds and, all these experiments, but nothing would grow. And, fictional perhaps. But in 1976, Missouri, as a bicentennial tribute, in other words, 1776, our nation has begun. 200 years later, 1976, Missouri actually took off the books of their state the extermination order. So you realize during my lifetime, when I traveled to Missouri, I was in jeopardy of losing my life because I would still say Joseph's a prophet. Okay, so, and what does this have to do with Boggs and his burial site? In 1976, they said for the first time grass began to grow. And so you'd say there is grass on the grave, but actually it's struggling to grow. I've had returned missionaries who have served in the same place as this Napa Stake Center, and also where the grave is, and they have told me on their P Day, they have taken the word literally, and they go up there and they urinate on his grave, and as a result, grass is struggling to grow. Okay. Okay, so there's Governor Boggs. Okay. Let's take Next Man. Okay, Next Man, and then we'll break, and then we'll come back. Well, I'm doing, if you've ever heard an old radio show called Paul Harvey, and, he always says, well, now for the rest of the story. Here's kind of the rest of the story of what happens. Let's do Alexander Donovan. Well, for Alexander Donovan, there's no question he has defended Joseph in kind of 3 court settings. And adding to it, he has asked for an appeal. He's done all kinds of things. Well, okay. When Joseph eventually escapes from Liberty Jail, Donovan hasn't done this as a freebie. In other words, it's not free. And he sends Joseph a bill for $5,000. And, you'd go, wow, that's beyond. That's huge for any time period, but really huge back then when you could get an acre for $3. Well, okay, Joseph gets the bill, and he hands it to Newell K. Whitney, the presiding bishop, and he says, pay this. Now, I'd love to do that with my bishop. The bills just came in. It looks like you get this one, and maybe I'll take this, okay. So suddenly the bill is now passed to the bishop, and Joseph says, pay this. Well, the bishop doesn't have a lot of money, that have come in via the church. And so he's now in contact with Donovan. And Donovan, by this point, he's an attorney, but he also likes real estate. And he also helped form a bank. And he also helped form a college. I mean, he's a whole bunch of things. And so Newell K. Whitney says, I tell you what, I'll give you lands of inheritance in Jackson County if you will forgive the debt of Joseph. What's wrong with that? Okay, you can't sell inheritance. You can't. Remember, Oliver Cowdery loses membership over that. And Newell K. Whitney says, oh, okay, let's kind of work things out. And with Donovan just being up there in Clay, and Jackson's the county just below, And suddenly we have prime property in downtown Independence, and Donovan says, I'll take it. Well, Nuke Whitney now comes to Joseph and says, you know, I've solved your indebtedness to Alexander Donovan. He said, I gave him property then in Independence. Joseph writes a quick letter to Donovan, and he says, don't accept it. And Joseph says, you give me time, I will pay this off. But don't accept the land. He said, in your hands, it will be cursed. Well, Donovan thought that was pretty funny. You know, in other words, this huge real estate in downtown Independence, a trailhead. Well, okay, meantime, Joseph dies. Years come and go, and it's now the Civil War. And in the Civil War, all states took a position, either north or south, except the state of Missouri. Well, suddenly, if you don't take a position, guess what? Northern troops come in and destroy the state. And then southern troops come in and destroy the state. And then here's the north, here's the south, and Missouri was devastated. Well, okay, after the war, Donovan, who had moved to Richmond, okay, he decides, I'm going to go check on my holdings. In other words, because I still have this estate. And so he's with his nephew. They're riding on horseback, and they get down to Independence. And suddenly, as he looks over what was once beautiful land, everything's destroyed. He can't even see a dog walking the streets. He sees a few smokestacks, you know, like chimneys. And he then turns to his nephew, and he said, I defended a man named Joseph Smith. And the nephew said, well, who's that? And he goes, you know, he's a Mormon prophet. Oh, yeah. And he said, I took this land as payment for my defense of Joseph. And he told me, he wrote me a letter. And he said, don't take this, the land will be cursed. And he said, you know, I laughed. And he then said to his nephew, what do you think? Was old Joe a prophet or not? And his nephew says, well, you tell me. In other words, look at this valuable land now destroyed. Well, okay, everybody, 10 minutes, do laps, you know, and we'll come back in and we'll kind of do what's the rest of the story, what happens to George Hinkle, well, what about that Sidney Rigdon, I suffered worse than Christ, you know, so, okay.